Okay, this next chapter is chapter 13, racial profiling. Learning objectives, we're going to talk about the historical background of the term racial profiling, define racial profiling, discuss the difference between racial profiling and legitimate use of profiling, explain the challenges involved with the use of profiling in the war on terrorism and drugs, for that matter. Identify the approaches used by police to prevent racial profiling, and discuss the rationale for and against the collection of racial profiling data. So what is a profile? Typically it's a document which contains criteria to help guide you in decision making. Now it's based on data that you've collected or interpreted to signify a trend that or a given particular set of circumstances that could lead you to believe that based on this particular set of circumstances there's going to be something going on, a criminal activity going on. Profiling is any action that uses a compilation of the background, physical, profile, behavioral, and/or motivational characteristics of a type of perpetrator that leads you to believe that this person is involved in criminal activity. Give an example. You got a burglar. Their MO is to their modus operandi, or method of operating, layman's terms there, is to ring their front doorbell. If nobody comes to the door, they wait 20 minutes to see if the police come. If there's an alarm, no alarm, they go kick the back door in. Again, they wait another 20 minutes to see if the alarm goes off. No alarm, they go in, they burglarize the house. They like taking jewelry and electronic equipment. That's their MO. So you've got a little bit of background on it. You've got some physical characteristics. This guy obviously got legs and arms, so you ring the doorbell and kick the door in. The type of, do you have a race? No, not necessarily, unless you've got some video surveillance. Maybe the neighbors or this person burglary says, I've got cameras in my house, so I could tell you at least generally what the guy looked like, that if somebody were to burglarize my house. So anyway, outside of having a race, that's what a profile is. Now, racial profiling is any police-initiated action that relies on the race or ethnicity rather than the behavior or specific information that leads to a particular individual, not a group of individuals, but a particular individual as having been engaged in criminal activity. So it relies on race and ethnic origin rather than behavior or information. Now, racially based policing, that's another term for racial profiling, occurs when they inappropriately consider the race or ethnicity in deciding with whom to intervene in enforcement capacity. It's illegal. In other words, maybe you've heard of people getting stopped because, quote unquote, they look like they didn't belong there. You look like you didn't belong here. Is that a legitimate reason to pull somebody over? Let me give you a hint, folks. In the Constitution, it says unreasonable, and what does a reasonable person say? What a reasonable person say, you can pull people over because they look like they don't belong there. Not in the United States. In other countries, yeah. Russia, China, other countries, yeah. Not in the United States. We've got the Constitution. It's a reverent document. Pay attention to it. You can't pull people over because they look like they don't belong there. Or you look like you're too young to be out and whatever. You know what? Not a good reason. The term racial profiling and racially based policing are synonymous. They mean the same. So a little bit of background on racial profiling. It really came to light in the 1990s when the war on drugs started. Drugs were had become during the 70s and 80s, crack cocaine, heroin, stuff like that. We're becoming a scourge in society, so we started this thing called the war on drugs. We did as a nation. And one of the things they were doing was they wanted to intercept the drug pipeline from coming in from outside the United States into the United States. And so what they did is they started looking at the people they were arresting, bringing in drugs, and they developed a profile, a criminal profile. And this criminal profile said that, I'll go with the New Jersey example, that people coming in through South Florida, Miami area. Drugs were coming in through boats, bringing the drugs in down there, dropping it off to people. They were transporting it north along the eastern seaboard, up in the mid-Atlantic section, New York, Washington, D.C., in that area in there. And primarily it was solo Hispanic males, a lot of Cuban descent males that were doing the transporting. And so they developed this criminal profile based on that information. And so they were stopping people that fit the quote-unquote profile of the drug courier. Now, sometimes they were doing that based on probable cause, such as expired registration. We'll talk about pretext stops a little bit later on. Sometimes it was just for the fact that they met this profile. And the Constitution says, you have to have reasonable suspicion, and we'll talk about whether or not that's reasonable suspicion later on. But at the time, we believed it was reasonable suspicion, and we'll talk about it more in depth a little bit later on in the lecture here. So they had this training called Operation Pipeline. It told us what to look for, how to search the car, what kind of characteristics we were looking for. And everybody that I worked with had this training, this Operation Pipeline training in the early 90s. I was sent to El Centro to work on a border task force down there, Southwest Border Task Force. Our main thing coming across the border back then was marijuana coming north from Mexico. And again, we had a profile of the type of person we were looking for. Normally it was a Hispanic male. Normally they were by themselves. Normally the car would be pretty bare except for the person sitting in the car. You and I, or maybe not you, maybe not you, but I got junk all over the car. I got McDonald's bags, I got school books, I got kids stuff, I've got my wife likes jackets. There's a dozen jackets in the car, all kinds of stuff like that. These people have nothing in the interior of the car. They don't have only one key on the key ring. Most of the time the car wasn't registered to them. You wouldn't find that out until after you stopped them. So that was a profile of that. So that's a little historical background on racial profiling. The mass roundup of people from the Middle East. What's that remind you of? A couple of chapters ago we talked about the Japanese during World War II. The Japanese government from Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden we're rounding up United States citizens that happen to be of Japanese descent and sending them off to intern camps for what? They hadn't committed any crime. We just got afraid. So what are some of the ways we develop the intelligence, the profiles? Well, in urban policing, a lot of times agencies now use a system called CompStat, which is computer statistics. And what they do is they look at the types of crimes, any other kind of data they've collected of it, and the data might include also the racial profile of the people or persons committing the crime. Is that legitimate? Yeah. If you got surveillance video of bank robbers and it's all, let me give you the Geezer Bandit, the old white guy. They don't know if it's his costume or whatever, but he used to rob banks in the San Diego area. If that's your profile, that's legitimate. If you use that race in there because you saw them from the videos or from the witnesses or whatever, this is the racial profile of the person that did it. Again, specific information tying a specific individual to a crime. As a victim's rights person, they would ask that we take claims of racial profiling seriously. In other words, if you're a police supervisor or even a fellow police officer and you believe that, or you get information that somebody's profiling based on race alone, doing that stop of, hey, you look like you don't belong here type of stop, you need to step up and do something about it. Especially if you're a supervisor, that's your job, but even as another officer, because one bad apple spoils a whole bunch there. So if you got one guy doing his own thing, and when I worked for the Highway Patrol, when I worked internal affairs, we call adverse actions. People we either terminated or disciplined because of the fact they were doing this. Profiling has long been a legitimate tool in law enforcement investigations. We often use profiling. Again, I said we looked at the completeness of the information you have, not just specifically the race. You can't use race alone except when you've got trustworthy information about a specific person doing some kind of unlawful conduct. Hanging around the neighborhood at night is not unlawful most of the time, even the daytime. In the Travis court opinion, they said that race can become a legitimate consideration when you have information about a particular suspect. I mentioned that before. Sorry about my phone going off there. I thought I had it on silent. Some other court decisions said that you can rely on your training and experience, looking at the totality of the circumstances. That's huge, totality of the circumstances. They don't pick one little segment out of an arrest. They look at the totality of the circumstances. What was going on before, middle, and after. Let me give you a DUI arrest. You're driving down the street, you hear tires squealing. You look around, you see a guy burning rubber down the street. You're pulling behind them, they're weaving around, and they got expired registration. You make a traffic stop, you walk up on the car, you smell alcohol, you get them out of the car, you give them tests, and you arrest them for DUI. That's the totality of the circumstances. You look at everything involved. It wasn't just that, hey, I saw a car and walked up to the guy and he was drunk and arrested him. No, you look at the totality of the circumstances. And you can rely on your training and experience. If you've worked in an area for a long time and you know that certain crimes happen in your area, and this is the criminal profile of the person doing the crime, as long as you use that experience to tie it into the totality of the circumstances to specific information about a crime, then yeah, you can look at it. Also, your training. In California, we have an agency called POST, which is Peace Officer Standards and Training. They regulate training in California. If you get a POST class, it's considered to be legitimate. Wren decision, huge decision. It talks about pretext stops. Now, what's a pretext stop? What a pretext stop is, you get stopped for something else. You get stopped for a legitimate reason, a traffic stop normally, but it could be a pedestrian stop. You get stopped for a legitimate reason, but they're investigating something else. Great example I used to use all the time was, I worked a lot of DUI enforcement. I made over 10,000 DUI arrests. I think I've told you guys that in the past. Made over 10,000 DUI arrests. That's when I stopped counting. And during that time, was everybody that I pulled over, did they have impaired driving? Not at all. I pulled people over for expired registration and they'd be under the influence. I pulled them over for headlight out at night, bald tires, whatever. Whatever reason I pulled them over, and I'd use those reasons, that probable cause to pull people over, to investigate whether or not they were under the influence of alcohol. During certain hours of the day, 1 in every 7 drivers is under the influence of alcohol. So it's just a statistical matter of pulling people over, you're going to get a DUI driver. So as long as you have probable cause that they got some kind of criminal violation. And yes, no front license plate is a criminal violation. It is a crime. Tinted windows is a crime. That's a criminal violation. That's a legitimate reason. I love to hear people say, I got pulled over for no reason. And then you ask them about it. Well, yeah, I had my music blasting. I had no front license plate, expired registration, tinted windows, and I was smoking marijuana in the car. But it was for no reason other than the fact that I was green, yellow, whatever color you were. Now, there are legitimately people that get pulled over for being green and yellow, but that's another story. So pretext stops are perfectly okay. I can pull you over for no front license plate and ask you about what kind of drugs you're transporting. Of course, you don't have to answer me, but I can ask you about it. Here. Data collection is a good idea to do, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of data collection to determine whether or not you're racial profiling. Let me give a little bit of my history on racial profiling. When I was with the Highway Patrol, I worked in our legal affairs section, our risk management section, and one of the things I had to manage when I was up there was a lawsuit we had where we were accused of racial profiling, and what it was doing is we were using that Operation Pipeline and stopping a lot of drivers that we suspected were transporting drugs. Most of the time those traffic stops were made based on reasonable suspicion. In one case, though, the driver was pulled over because the sergeant thought it was unusual that he had driven by this location 4 times and was filming. Well, the reason he was doing that, he was an attorney, he was filming our actions to see whether or not we were doing it legally. And so it came back to bite the department, the CHP, in the rear, because this person sued us. He found a bunch of other people that had been stopped and sued the Highway Patrol. And the Highway Patrol took the proactive step before the lawsuit settled, even saying, hey, you know what, why don't we start collecting data on our traffic stops? So we collected the date and time, the characteristics of the individual, the reason for the stop, whether or not it was a penal code violation, whether or not it was somebody else called in, something like that. Or maybe it was just you encountered somebody that was broke down on the side of the road. Whether or not the car was searched, what authority was used to search, probable cause, arrest, whatever, what was found, if anything was found, and what we did with the person. Did we write him a citation? Did we arrest him? Did we give him a warning? Or just left? Left him be. That'd be like somebody broke down on the side of the road. You stop and call him a tow truck. No enforcement action there. But anyway, we started recording all that information from everybody we contacted to try to demonstrate that, or actually to investigate whether or not profiling was occurring. And sure enough, the statistics showed that the ethnicity, race, and gender of the people that we were citing was actually pretty consistent with the number of people in the population. In other words, say you were in an area that had a 70% population of Caucasians. Santa Clarita, California, at the time, back then, had about a 70%, say Stevenson Ranch, of Caucasians. If you were stopping in proportionally amount of Hispanics or blacks, then that would be an issue, but it wasn't, because the fact that our stats showed that we were stopping predominantly Caucasians in that area. So pretty consistent with the population. That was the CHP's data collection. Now, those forms were a pain in the rear. We'll talk about it in a minute here, but they were good for the department. No pain, no gain, right? Some of the arguments in favor are, hey, if you're being accused of racially profiling, let's back it up with some evidence here. And it conveys a commitment to unbiased policing by collection of data. Arguments against it, it really doesn't. Some people argue that it really doesn't talk about the whole aspect of the problem. Another one they say is that it wastes time, and it does. It not necessarily wastes time, it costs time. Doing those forms take a lot of time. Sometimes it would take 2 hours a day just to do those forms. That's out of an 8-hour day. It was a lot of time out of your day working on those forms. And it can be used against you like in a lawsuit or something. So people were real hesitant to collect that data. Again, when you're collecting that data, you want to look at, does it match up with the population of your area? Now, some areas have what they call a transient population. Not mean transient like, homeless people. I mean, I'll give you an example. Interstate 5. If you're working traffic patrol on Interstate 5, the population changes on a minute-by-minute basis, because people are using that as a corridor to run between parts south and parts north. Not necessarily from California, not necessarily the residents of the area there. So you'd really have to look at what we call the field observation of the population to see who, quote-unquote, the population is of that area. And even during certain days, and the first thing in the morning on Interstate 5, between about 5 and 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, it's all commute traffic. After that, it breaks down. It's people going shopping, people going to the beach, people on vacation, going to Disneyland, whatever. So when I talk about population of the community, communities change population. Again, look at the individual police officer. I love telling the story about an officer of mine that used to get complaints, and for us, it used to be that if you got a certain number of complaints, it would kick out your name. The supervisor have to go talk to you and say, why are you getting these complaints? And I had one officer that got the name kicked out for complaints, but I knew him very well, and I also looked at his activity. He was doing 2 to 3 times the activity of any other officer around him. Now, you're going to run into people like that, the people that work twice as hard as anybody else in any business you're in. And that was this guy's. He was a motorcycle officer, and that was his method. He went out and worked twice as hard as anybody else. So of course he had more contacts, so he had more chances of getting complaints. Now, none of the complaints were sustained. Some of the complaints were like bizarre. One person complained. They called me up and they said, there's a black man in my neighborhood, and this is how outrageous it gets. And I go, okay, is he doing something suspicious? Well, yes, he's wearing a motorcycle officer's uniform. And I said,
well, he probably works for us. You know, can you describe him any better? Yep, that sounds like my buddy. I'm not going to give his name out. That sounds like my officer. He's out there doing his job. Is he doing something wrong? Oh no, I just thought it was unusual that there was a black man riding a motorcycle in our neighborhood. And I go, let me get this straight. He's a CHP officer on a motorcycle, and he's African American, and you have a problem with that? Well, not really. I just thought you might want to know. Well, what kind of a complaint is that? You know, cracker. What do you tell this person? Get a life? Crawl out from under that rock you've been under for the last 25 years? I don't know. Great officer he was, though. Loved working with him. Just saw him the other day, as a matter of fact, 4th of July. Anyway, look at different departments have different cultural behaviors too. Some smaller departments are a little more aggressive, and you know they might have a chance of racially profiling. Larger departments, you know, they've kind of gotten the message. Not necessarily, but some departments have gotten the message. You can also compare the rates of individual officers to the Department of Behavior. So say you got an individual officer that you believe might be maybe based on complaints or other officers' complaints. You can look at his or her activity and say, oh wow, it does look like you're stopping more people of color than you are of not of color. And you can talk to them about it, or you can, you know, take a closer look at them, monitor the behavior a little bit closer, go out and ride with them, train them, do whatever it is that make sure they're not doing the bad racial profiling. So let's recap our learning objectives here. We talked about the historical background of the term racial profiling. And we talked about how racial profiling differs from legitimate police profiling and criminal activity. We talked about the challenges involved in use of racial profiling in the war on terrorism and the war on drugs. We identified some approaches used by police departments to prevent racial profiling, and we discussed some of the reasons that people have for doing data collection, some of the reasons they have for not doing data collection. This video lecture is meant to supplement the readings in the book, so be sure and go through the book, read the book. There are assessments that you'll have to do during this module, so go over to chapter module 13, chapter 13 assessments. There's a discussion board question, go do that. We're moving right along here.